The first talk today is about apologetics during the Reformation. Now, apologetics, the word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a defense, and it generally refers to defending the faith. Now, this can be done in two different contexts. One of them is defending the faith in a way that encourages and supports believers. It can also be used offensively, if you will, as a way of going after people who don't believe your particular religious viewpoint or who are themselves attacking the faith. So you can use it either to try to advance and spread the faith or to strengthen the people who are already believers. You see both of these uses in the Reformation. Now, I should say right off the bat that I'm not going to go through the details of what they said apologetically. Luther writes treatises against the Mass, against the sacraments in the church, against the papacy. We could go through an unending list of these. Rather, what I want to do is look at apologetic strategies and how the reformers used different means of communication to do apologetic work, both in terms, again, of strengthening the faith of their own religious community and going on the offense against others. So that's the big picture of what we're trying to do here. Now, I want to begin at sort of the lowest level, at the level of sort of the general population, not so much the high-level theological arguments. What's happening on the ground at the level of the average person in the pew? For this, probably the most effective place we need to begin is with the popular press. Printing was a relatively new invention at the time of the Reformation. It was invented roughly 1450 in Germany, movable metal type. And you can make the argument that the reason why the Protestant Reformation succeeded, whereas a number of other very similar reform programs didn't, is the effect of the printing press. Wycliffe in the 1300s had many of the same ideas as Luther. His ideas had a temporary influence in England, but then they were suppressed. Jan Hus in Bohemia, similarly, very, very similar ideas to Luther, had actually a much longer term influence, but only in Bohemia, and that only because some of his followers were very effective military generals. The ideas don't spread any further. Luther comes along, and with the 95 Theses, his ideas spread across Germany. They get translated and spread into other countries very, very quickly. Why? Well, because of the printing press. That allowed Luther to produce massive quantities of literature that could be disseminated widely and therefore could not be systematically collected and burned. There were just too many copies. The best way to preserve something is not to lock it away in a vault, it's to spread it far and wide. Luther himself at one point said that God invented the printing press to reform his church. So printing is critically important here. And what we often don't understand, when we think about printing, we normally think about books and things like that, especially in this period, because most people, when they study this period and they look at primary sources, they're looking at the books, they're looking at the tracts and treatises and things like that. What we don't frequently recognize is that there was printing not just of these larger works, but of smaller works that were actually designed for people who were illiterate. So printing actually can bring you below the level of literacy, or you can reach an audience below the level of literacy if you use it appropriately. And in fact, that's what we see happening with Luther very, very quickly. Probably the most prominent example of this are things that are known as broadsides. A broadside is a folio-sized piece of paper, a poster, on the top of which is generally some form of illustration. A cartoon, a more elaborate drawing of some sort, and then underneath it there would be a text, frequently in verse, often as a poem. And the way these broadsides were used, they were essentially propaganda pieces typically. The cartoon could communicate a great deal of content. People knew how to read these images. They understood that there's a set of stock stereotypical images. You can simply look at the cartoon and understand generally what's going on. In a lot of ways, it resembles a political cartoon. In the United States, if you're looking at a political cartoon and you see an eagle, you know it represents the United States. If you see a donkey, you know it's the Democrats. An elephant, you know it's the Republicans. You can move this on a national level. A lion is traditionally associated with England, a bear with Russia. There's a standard vocabulary that goes on within political cartoons today. You had the same kind of visual vocabulary in the 16th century. People would recognize and could tell just from the picture, generally speaking, what was going on, what generally was happening. And then the verse or the text underneath it would reinforce the message. So these could be used by people who were illiterate just with the cartoon, but more often than not, what would end up happening is the broadsides would be taken to a place like a tavern, a pub, and they'd be put up there, and someone in the pub would know how to read. If nothing else, just the local priest or pastor. Frequently the priests even were literate, but the pastor or someone else would go there and would read off the verse for the people who were there who couldn't read it. And so this was a way of communicating ideas about the Reformation. They were generally, they're small, they're short, so they're discrete, single idea kind of things. And these can be either pro-Luther, typically, or anti-Catholic. Could go either way. So I've seen illustrations, for example, where there's an image taken straight out of the book of Revelation of the seven-headed dragon that's sitting on 7 hills, and it's actually wearing papal regalia. So it's obvious that they're identifying the Pope as the Antichrist. And Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon are there with fire coming out of their mouths as the two witnesses of the book of Revelation. So you have images like that. You also have others that are, well, you have to understand Luther was a peasant. I heard him once described as the beer-drinking son of a beer-drinking peasant. And Luther could get exceptionally crude, both in his language and in, well, frankly, the illustrations on these broadsides. Now, I don't think he was actually responsible for doing the drawings, but I'm sure he inspired them. There's one rather famous example that I like to cite of Cardinal Cajetan. Cajetan was a Catholic theologian who'd had a number of friendly discussions, actually not too friendly, with Luther about the Reformation. And Luther got rather fed up with Cajetan. Cajetan is writing against Luther. He's trying to undermine what Luther is doing. And so the depiction of Cajetan was, now, like I said, excuse me, this is crude, but it was a buttocks with a harp sticking out of it and a cardinal's hat on top of it. So his face was made up of the buttocks, the nose was the harp, and the cardinal's hat on top, and the regalia under it. And then there was a verse about Cajetan under it. Now, what may not be obvious to you, if you haven't actually been around period harps, is that if you take a harp outside and the wind blows, the strings will sound. It'll actually cause the strings to vibrate. So the unmistakable communication of this is that Cajetan's words are the equivalent of flatulence. Okay. So this is, like I said, they could get crude, but the whole point is, all right, now here's the apologetic purpose. You ridicule your opponents. You make your opponents look foolish. You make them look bad. You do anything you can to ridicule them, to get people laughing at them so that they don't take them seriously. Actually, in a serious way, that is an apologetic tool for this period, especially when you are dealing with sort of the general populace, the lower classes, the less educated people. An educated person would appreciate the humor of that image, but wouldn't be convinced by it particularly. The less well-educated can be influenced much more easily through the use of these kinds of images rather than focusing so much on words. Along with the broadsides, you also have various other short pieces that are designed to be very topical, very immediate to the situation. This is another thing that printing gives us. It allows us not just to write long works, long books that are going to be read, 500 years later, but small, well, we would describe them like pamphlets and things like that. Again, the term for the period that we use to describe these is ephemera. because they're ephemeral. They're here today, gone tomorrow. They cease to be relevant. Printing allows you to do that, though, because you can produce large quantities of these on short notice for an immediate situation, distribute them, and then if they become out of date in 2 weeks, who cares? It's not a big deal. You just do another one. So there's a growing use of these kinds of ephemeral publications as well to spread ideas, to address immediate issues, to try to influence the way people are thinking about political or other kinds of issues that are coming up, and so on. So this is one whole thing. We can describe the broadsides and the ephemera and things like that as the popular press, the things that are getting out into the general public. Now, another way that the populace, though, as a whole is influenced is through public debates. Now, these are not the formal theological disputations that would take place between two theologians in a more academic atmosphere. That's important as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what will happen during this period is there will be public disputations about religion that were very, very high stakes debates because they could determine the religious direction of an entire city. So what would happen, well, first of all, we need, once again, I covered this in one of the other talks, but you need, just as a reminder, you need to understand that in this period, the basic academic exercise that people did was to debate. Today, I assign term papers to my students. I write articles. It's essentially a term paper. You know, we write papers today. In this period, they debated. A student to graduate had to pass his debates. He would hold debates with other people and he had to pass them. There's a regular procedure that was followed for this. Academicians debated each other. This is what professors did. Now, they also wrote and things like that, but the primary thing that they're doing is debating. Now, Protestant pastors were extremely well trained. The Protestant Reformation, more than anything else, is about ideas. The thing that sets the Protestant Reformation apart from the Catholic Reform in this period is that Catholic Reform was focused on practice. Protestant Reform was focused on ideas. The basic concept being that if you get the theology right, the practice will follow. If you just deal with the practice and the theology is bad, the practice is going to deteriorate again. So Protestantism is based around ideas. And as a result, Protestant pastors were actually very, very well trained in theology. They emphasized biblical languages from a very early date. They emphasized study of Scripture directly. They emphasized theology. They emphasized knowing the Catholic arguments and counter-arguments. All of these kinds of things. Your average pastor was an expert theologian. It's as simple as that, especially in the early days of the Reformation. So as Protestantism begins to spread, what starts happening is a group of pastors, sometimes specialists, sometimes not, would would go to a Catholic city and they would challenge the local priests to a debate. Now, remember in this period, many priests were uneducated. They didn't even understand the Latin of the Mass that they chanted each week. In the cities, you are more likely to find priests with education, but they did not have a particularly high power education. The ones who were really well trained as theologians or whatever became canon lawyers or moved into higher offices of the church, something like that. They weren't your typical priests operating within the context of a city. Even the bishops, if they had a lot of training, and many of them didn't, were typically trained in canon law, not in theology. So what would happen is these Protestant pastors, these expert theologians, would go in and would challenge local Catholic priests to a public debate in front of the town council and in front of the population. And they would arrive and they would tell the Catholic priests, okay, thank you for having this debate. You can start. It's your city. We'll let you go first. So the Catholic priest would stand up and start presenting his case for Catholicism. And as he did it, the Protestant pastors would interrupt and say, excuse me, you didn't get that right. According to canon law, this canon, this chapter, this heading, this is the way it goes. So what you're saying is kind of right, but it's not exactly right. This is the way, the canon law is actually written. Or, well, your theology there isn't quite correct according to this church council or this decree or whatever. This is the... So they actually would demonstrate that they knew Catholic theology better than the priest did. They would keep correcting them as he went along. which of course is a great tactic because it gets the priests even more flustered. But the fact is, they knew this stuff better than the priests did. Then when it became their side, they would take up whatever issues the priests brought up and dismantle them. They would dismantle not only what the priest said, but what the actual canon law or church decrees or whatever said. So in the process, they would demonstrate that the priest didn't really know what he was talking about, that even his best arguments didn't hold water. We've got a much better case to make. And what's more, we can give a positive presentation, not just destroy what he's saying, we can give a positive presentation of what we believe, backed up with scriptural verses and everything else. The effect of this is in city after city after city, the Protestant pastors would win these debates so thoroughly that the town council would almost immediately vote to convert to Protestantism. This is the primary way that Protestantism spreads, not the only way, but the primary way that Protestantism spreads through the cities. Now, it's worth noting that later on the Catholic Church catches up, particularly with the founding of the Jesuits, who were always very highly educated. The Jesuits, by the late 1500s, start doing the same thing back to the Protestants. By then, pastoral education had gone into a bit of a decline. So the Jesuits were actually better trained than the pastors, and one of the ways that the Counter-Reformation works is by reversing this process and defeating the Protestants at it. In any event, we move from there to theological disputations. These are the formal debates that take place. This is a step higher than the debates in the cities. These are the formal debates that will take place between people like Luther and Eck in Leipzig, or, well, any number of others as we go along. Now, what these do is they pit two groups of truly expert theologians against each other. And, well, there are two forms of these. There are the public forums where it's done live. It's done as a live debate, but you also can do these in print. So let's talk about the live debates first. What you will find in debates during this period is both sides are certainly doing their best to present their best arguments. But these are not the kind of formal debates that we think of, at least in America. They're much closer to Oxford debates, which is another way of saying that you certainly want to make the best case you can, but cheap shots, ad hominems, snide comments about your opponents are just part of the procedure. My personal favorite example of this is when Luther was debating Herr Dr. Eck at Leipzig. He actually continued to refer to him sort of as Herr Dr. Eck, except he pronounced the doctor, the DR, and ran it into the word, so it became Herr Dreck. Dreck is a German word that translates literally to dirt, but it's a particular type of dirt. You can have chicken dreck and cow dreck and horse dreck and so on. So he habitually referred to him during the debate as Herr Dreck. Eck, for his part, replied by ignoring the fact that Luther had a doctorate. He dropped the doctor altogether and referred to him as Herr Lügner or Herr Liar. So you had Lügner versus Dreck. I mean, this is the way these debates are conducted. But there's also substance as well. That's linking us back into Cajetan's harp. But there's substance to the debates as well. And there's one important factor that occurs during these debates, by the way. It's the Leipzig debate with Eck that really drives Luther to realize that the implications of his theology really do lead him to a break with Rome. So it actually serves in many ways to advance Luther's thinking and to push him to greater consistency with his own views. But you have these formal debates that will take place between the theologians. The ones that end up actually, I think, having a larger impact occur not so much in an actual debate context, but debates that take place in print. So, for example, someone will write a treatise attacking a theologian for an idea. That theologian will write a response. Sometimes there'll be a counter-response and a counter to the counter, and so on. And these things will then progress as, if you will, literary debates that are taking place. Probably the best known example is a man named Pigius wrote a treatise attacking Calvin's doctrine of predestination. Calvin's response to Pigius is one of the great statements on the predestination side of the free will predestination debate. In the Reformation, the two great exchanges we have on this are Erasmus's freedom of the will and Luther's bondage of the will, and then Pigius and Calvin. And frankly, in this particular case, Calvin absolutely destroyed Pigius. It was probably one of the strongest statements and most effective statements in this kind of debate. So in any event, you have these things taking place in print. And by the way, for those who are interested, Calvin's Institutes, he describes it as, in his introduction, he says what it is loci communes et disputationes. Loci communes translates to commonplaces, or we'd say the common themes of the Bible. The ideas that go across many books. Calvin methodologically believed that when he wrote a commentary, it should be about the specifics that that book contains. It shouldn't really discuss the broader issues. Those should be placed elsewhere in a commonplace book. So the broad themes of Scripture were put into the Institutes, et disputationes, and disputations. So all of these theological debates that he's gotten into in print, the core of his answer gets moved into the Institutes as well. From there, we can move to our last category, which is theology in the vernacular. You have these formal theological debates, disputations, treatises, things like that are done in Latin because that's the academic language of the day. But increasingly, what the Reformation does that's new and different is it begins producing quality theological writings in the vernacular languages. Now, to some extent, we see this already with Luther, where he's writing, he has a tract writing spree around 1520 after the Leipzig debate, where he produces the Babylonian captivity of the church, the address to the Christian nobility of the German nation, a whole bunch of others, right in this period where he's writing theological arguments aimed at specific groups. But these aren't exactly formal theology. They are, in a sense, of a kind of polemical theology. He is making an argument here in the vernacular. But what you see particularly with Calvin is that he is going to begin producing biblical commentaries and formal theological writings in French. And it's actually this process of doing this, where he's doing formal theology in the French language, that will cause the French Reformation to go from its rather shapeless initial form in the 1540s. It's going to move very, very sharply in the direction of Calvinism, because for the first time, they are getting high-quality, formal theological writings that will appeal to people who are educated, but who might not be completely conversant with Latin, might not be that comfortable with it, might not read that much Latin. It's putting this kind of work in their hands, and it serves a very important function then to spread and to consolidate the faith of the Protestants of France. Other people will follow suit afterwards. So I ran out of time about a minute ago. So that's the end of this one. Are there any questions? What we can learn from this, I would suggest, is that the Protestants, in their effort to defend and with that to spread the faith and to deal with the opposition, used every form of media that was available. They used it in a very shrewd way. They understood how to use the media effectively, both orally and in writing, to communicate, to strengthen their own community, and to push back against particularly the Catholics. Now, to be honest with you, they're also going to be doing this against each other. So one thing I didn't mention, the Protestants will also be attacking other Protestants. But the key point here is, who did they address? Well, they addressed the illiterate people in the taverns. They addressed the moderately educated. They addressed the well-educated. They addressed the theologians. They had a multi-pronged strategy that hit every segment of society. And they made very effective use of the new media of printing that was available in their day. So what I would suggest today, the lessons we draw from this immediately are, first of all, we have to know our stuff. The Protestant pastors were trained as expert theologians. We have to know our own case, and we have to know the counter-arguments. We have to know the position of our opponents as well as they do, or better. So we need to understand who our opponents are, what it is we're responding to, have effective responses there, and have a solid understanding of our own faith. We need knowledge. But along with that, we also need to have a certain amount of, if you will, media savvy. We need to understand what the implications of the new media of our day are, and we've got to work out ways to use it effectively. Now, just a word on this. The printing press had an enormous impact on all kinds of things beyond the obvious. So it preserves writing, it disseminates writing. Those are the obvious things. But it also produces other changes. For example, by reducing the cost of books, it makes it possible for the first time for people to actually become self-educated in a subject. Calvin never had a course in theology. He learned his theology by reading. That would not have been possible prior to that. It makes it possible to actually encourage new creative thinking, because people can accumulate more books. They can look at a variety of different kinds of sources, and this can stimulate their own thinking. It increases our understanding of the precision of texts. Prior to this, every manuscript was hand-copied, and in the back of your mind, you knew the copyist probably made a mistake somewhere. Books change that. And in particular, that increase in precision makes it possible to do things like produce tables that show the position of planets and the stars, which increases the accuracy of astronomical work, and it helps lead to the proofs for heliocentrism. So it serves to advance science because of the increased precision. There are all kinds of things that printing does that have a substantial change, that produce substantial changes in society. I would argue that the new media are producing similar changes in our society. Some of them are good, a lot of them are bad. But what we need to do is, just like Luther almost had an instinctive sense of how best to use print, we need to really think hard about the strengths and weaknesses of the current technology and try to get ahead of the curve rather than lagging behind in figuring out how to use it effectively to spread and defend our ideas. So those would be a couple of things that I would draw out of this. Is the Reformation to blame for the rise of liberal theology, as Catholics will claim? I would argue that that is actually something of a mistaken notion. The liberal theology arises as a result of Enlightenment thought, and I don't think you can really blame the Enlightenment on the Protestants, especially when you take a look at many of the key figures. They're actually Catholics. The liberal theology arises because of multiple different strains coming together kind of simultaneously. Let's take a look, for example, the example I'll use is Johannes Zemler. Zemler is considered the father of comparative religion. He's also very important in the early development of higher criticism. Zemler grew up in a confessional Lutheran church. Now, in this period, we're in the late 1600s, this is a period in which the trajectory of Protestantism has gone in the direction of emphasizing finely detailed theologies. You develop confessions not so much to find ways to agree with people, but to define where you differ. So they're very, very precise, finely tuned statements of theology for each different confession. And they're written, like I said, to exclude people who aren't in your group. Okay. So Zemler grows up in that environment. Now, there were people in Germany who objected to this, who said that this theological hair splitting isn't helpful, and who argued that this was reducing faith to mere assent to a bunch of propositions, to a bunch of statements. This group was known as Pietists, and they argued that what's important is more of a warm personal faith. We don't have to worry about all the details and the intricacies of theology. That's not what's so important. So that's a second strand that's coming in Germany in this period. By the way, you can find parallels to both of those within Catholicism. The third strand is rationalism. This is coming in out of the Enlightenment. And what's going to emerge from the rationalist tradition here is an increasing emphasis on reason above revelation. A very non-Protestant idea, I may add, because Protestantism is built on the idea of sola scriptura, that scripture alone is a source of authority. Well, the rationalist tradition says otherwise. The rationalist tradition says you may be a Christian and you may hold the scriptures in high regard, but reason trumps scripture. If Scripture teaches something that's contrary to reason, we should reject it. Okay. In Zemler, all three of these come together. As I said, he was raised as a confessional Lutheran. He was in a pietist community and was influenced by pietism. And he was also at the university exposed to rationalism. And it's the combination of these three. He continues to insist on Lutheran orthodoxy theologically, but the pietist strain encourages him to think that, well, the specific doctrines aren't that important. Maybe it's not that important even for us to accept the authority of Scripture. So he's going to merge the rationalist and the pietist together. And this is going to result in him, frankly, rejecting the authority of Scripture, arguing that there are a lot of other religions that end up influencing Christianity and shaping Christianity, shaping the Scripture, all of these kinds of things. And lo and behold, you get one of the founders of theological liberalism. It's not so simple as to say it came out of the Protestant Reformation. All of these other strains become important in Zemler's life, and I would argue the rationalist one is the most important. Now the question then becomes, do you derive rationalism from Protestantism? I would argue no, because again, the insistence on Scripture alone being the source of truth, which is really at the core of a core Protestant belief, suggests that rationalism isn't the right way to go.